hello again. It's nice to be back. And I do have to say that Hazel and I didn't actually coordinate our dress this morning. In fact, we only met yesterday, and we turned up today wearing identical clothes. So it's not a moderator's uniform, it was complete accident. Anyway, good to be back. We've had a great session this morning, very interactive. We're going to continue with the interactivity again in this session. And I'm going to follow Greg's lead this morning and actually ask my panel this time to introduce themselves, because we have two very, very different profiles of people here with Mark and Dr. Yasser. And just before they go into introducing themselves, I just want to highlight, we're talking here about volunteerism, and we have a CEO, paid chief staff, responsible for the business of his association and all the rest, and we have a multifaceted professional doctor working in a volunteer leadership position of at least 2, but probably about 4 associations. So they come from a very different world, one from the staff side, one from the volunteer leadership side. So Mark, why don't we start with you introducing yourself? Tell us a little bit about your role, the organization, and also, because some of the comments I think you're going to refer to other organizations that you were either leader of or staff member of.
Great, thank you. And thank you for your time today. My name is Mark Dorsey. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Construction Specifications Institute. Our members are the folks that take a design for a building and specify which products are ultimately going to make their way into the final construction. We're about 7,000 members. I've been in associations almost forever, fell into it. I've been with a student association that managed to vote itself out of existence and create a new academic model in its place. I worked for 20 some odd years with the Professional Ski Instructors of America and the American Association of Snowboard Instructors and the National Ski Patrol. Between those two groups, it was about 56,000 members. I started as the marketing director, was their CEO for 9 years. And notably with the ski instructors grew from about 16,000 members to well over 31,000 members in a market where the number of actual ski areas declined by 30 to 40%, and the market itself was only about 6% growth. And I've also served on the board and worked with the Medical Education Credentialing Association with, of course, a volunteer board. So to land today in construction.
Great, thank you, Mark. Dr. Yasser.
Okay, good morning. Thank you, Nick, for the introduction. I'm Yasser Farahat, professor of urology. I am originally from Egypt. I moved to Dubai 7 years ago. And as Nick said, I am engaged in multiple specialized societies of urology, but I am focusing about the Emirates Urological Society, which has been initiated in 2011 and started with a couple of volunteers, about 13 individual, and nowadays we are 240. On the other hand, I am representing the Secretary General of the Arab Association of Urology, which is association of all Arab urological societies in 22 Arab countries. This is the main two organizations which I'm working deeply in them, and we achieved a lot of success with a couple of years, and other activities, we will discuss it later.
Thank you, great. So not only do we have a CEO versus Secretary General and leader of a couple of associations, but of course we have two very different cultures and very different regions represented with Mark and Dr. Yasser. And part of what we hope to do this morning is see the contrasts between the cultural impact on volunteerism. But to get us started, Dr. Yasser, let me start with you. How, in the context of your association experience and working as a volunteer leader, how do you define volunteerism? What does it actually mean?
I have to be very clear that in Arab world, we are facing a challenge that the concept of volunteer is not clearly defined. So it may be different than in US and Europe because we are not building the concept of volunteers in our young kids in the schools or in the early career of life. And this is one of the real challenges that we are facing, how to engage and how to establish the concept of volunteers when we start to build up and grow up our societies. On the other hand, I believe also that the concept of volunteerism from the side of the societies also is not well defined, because it started on a personal, individual gathering of people without any clear standard criteria of having the volunteers to be engaged in the society. And this making a difficulty and a delay to engage people successfully in societies and to work actively. This is the reality from two aspects, from the volunteer themselves and from the society.
Is there something happening with a microphone?
I think it's okay.
Don't step on that bit.
Okay. I think it's working now.
Now, you good?
Yeah,
Is sure? Are you happy with that, guys?
Is it okay?
yeah. So in summary, I
No.
think it's
No,
Let's try.
I save.
Something's working. Fine, I think. You want to use that? You want to be on this? You okay? Cool?
okay. So in summary, I think the concept of volunteers in the last few years, it was not clearly defined at both levels, both the volunteers themselves and the associations in our region. And this, we realized that, and we worked hardly to standardize the concept of volunteers and how to make a plan how to engage volunteers in our society.
Great. So in many respects, you don't really know you're volunteering. You've just had an idea, you've started the association, and it's not a concept that's readily understood. So Mark, let's go to you. How do you define volunteerism?
So I define volunteerism as an individual or any group that gets together to provide some sort of work, some sort of product on behalf of another community. So it might be an association by definition to associate. It might be for your local community. It could be to improve health. It could be to improve society. It could be to improve commerce. And I differentiate that from philanthropy, which I would define as just simply, providing money so that others can do that or to a cause. So it really is that act of putting forth labor to define a standard or some sort of work product or guidance to a community.
Right. And let's just address this sort of cultural difference between the regions from the get-go. So in the United States, the concept of volunteering is drilled into you, from school days. Just explain to us a little bit about just the nature of volunteerism, and also what have you seen changing in the last, let's say, 10 years? Because I know also in the United States, it's not as easy to get volunteers today as it was, say, 10 years ago.
I think so let me take the cultural difference first, and then how it has influenced. I think it's just been part of the fabric in not only the United States but North America, because if you think about kind of the frontier culture, and we have a very laissez-faire, hands-off approach to government, that society had to get together to fill in gaps. So we had government here, we had the private sector here, and in between you have this volunteer and nonprofit community, and the nonprofit community economically is $1 trillion sector. So it makes up gaps that a community might not pay for or be able to otherwise do for itself. And it's, I'm not going to say it's entirely unique, it just exhibits itself very differently in the US culture. How it's changed is the way that volunteerism is rewarded and what people expect out of it has changed in part because of demography, certainly immigration and cultural influences in the United States, and technology. As we're pressed for time, we heard a conversation about micro-volunteering earlier. As we're pressed for time, I think that changes what volunteerism looks like. But I don't think it's entirely true that there's less volunteerism. Okay. It just looks different than it did. It's not getting together at the clubhouse or with the group, to put on either a fundraiser or raise a house or to have a meeting about the bylaws, whereas all of that shifted much more towards what's the purpose. I mean, purpose has always been there. That's why those organizations formed to begin with. But it's how we go about that business has definitely changed.
Okay, so we'll build on some of those points in a minute, but let's go back to Dr. Yasser, because I think you said in your opening comments, volunteerism isn't really understood here. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and what your observations are of the challenge we face, therefore, with volunteerism in this region, particularly in the Emirates?
Actually, we have to recognize that working in Arab world, it may be different than US, because as Arab Association, we are representing the 22 Arab countries, which is totally different in culture, in thinking, in different things. So to gather people from different culture, it's not an easy task. On the other hand, I have also another experience with working with Emirates Urological Society. As all of you know, that Dubai or Emirates is hosting multi-nationality. So also we are dealing with multiple urologists coming from different countries, each one with different skills, different culture, different behavior. So really it was difficult to start. So our main idea to start that we have to collect and gather a database. And gathering a database, it was very helpful to understand the nature and the skills and the special interest of each of urologists working in the region. Then we worked on categorization of each of our members, and this will make us more close to our members and the individuals. Based on the knowledge of having their interest, their skills, and their capabilities, so we started to make the platform which can be suitable for each, attract each one in his field of interest. And we succeeded to build some subspecialty in urology, which fits the needs of our members. And this was very attractive to initiate the volunteer action from the members. Still, we have some challenges because the concept in the region, due to different socio-economic level, that volunteer action should be rewarded, or there should be awarded at a certain level or at a certain stage. And still, we are working to define exactly how to reward those volunteers who are achieving the tasks or filling their requirements.
So you've raised a number of points there. The journey, first of all, with the Urological Society of how to find the other urologists to join. Just because you created the society, sorry, this is very boring, I keep dropping my pen. Just because you created the society, it didn't mean that people were instantly going to join. You actually, the founders, all of the volunteer leaders went out and did the process of the research and finding and identifying their needs. So there's a lot of volunteer work going on behind the scenes there. And you also have introduced the concept of reward and an expectation, perhaps in this culture, that there should be a reward. Just giving your time is not necessarily commonly understood. Is that what you were meaning when you were talking about the reward?
Exactly. Reward, we are not going to a financial compensation for their work and their time, but we're working to something, rewarding them with appreciation, some sort of appreciation in gathering. In the annual conference, we appreciate those volunteers who achieve the targets. So it will motivate them to be committed for a long time, because this is the main challenge. If I have a volunteer today and working and achieve his task, what I need to keep him for long term to continue his volunteer action with the society. So without motivation, without rewarding, we may lose some of those volunteers. So we are keeping rewarding and appreciating conference and trying to find a position for them who is achieving his task. We try to find a position, suitable position for him for the future in the society.
So public recognition amongst peers, and then seeing the talents of those that are putting in the time, and then also creating roles for them to maybe lead a committee or a task force. So Mark, let's contrast that with the business model of American associations, where there isn't so much challenge to attract volunteers, but what is the motivation? Why are people joining as volunteer leaders? Are they looking for something in particular? How are you going about, in today's world, encouraging them into leadership positions and to give their volunteer time?
Yeah, I wish I could say we were spectacular at it, but this is a great point. And Greg talked earlier about when he was talking about somebody coming on staff and talking about the 5 years. What are they going to do 5 years together? In order to attract and retain good volunteers, I think you have to be very explicit about what's expected, what might be expected, what kind of work would be there, and what's the intrinsic reward. And I think that's an element, at least certainly in my experience with the US, and being sensitive to what a good reward is within the culture is really, really critical. So part of my reward might be I get the opportunity to lead in a position where I might not have led before. I gain experiences that I might not gain in my work experience that I can bring back. I get to see the outcome, and to get right to your point of what are people attracted to? Well, they're attracted to purpose. And if you're clear in the purpose and how you contribute to that purpose, frankly, whether I'm paid or not as a staff member, if we're working for purpose-driven organizations, you want to see that purpose come to fruition. And so it's a combination of paid labor and volunteer labor to make that happen. The better you are at that, the better you recognize that effort, the better you're going to have a good relationship with your volunteers. The more that's left to chance, I think the more you have an opportunity for hard feelings. Egos get hurt, people might not come up, or worse, folks burn out. That somebody else will go in and say, well, this is kind of they don't do such a great job, so I'm going to go and do it all myself. Well, that doesn't help. That's not a volunteer organization, except for a volunteer organization of one. And if you have local, national, or global aspirations, you have to be able to rely on a broader base of volunteers. Without volunteers, we can't do as a staff anything. We're there to serve them. They are our community and our customer base.
Excellent. And
Can I just
Dr.
one?
Yasser, please.
Actually, what we recognize that to attract the volunteers to our society, to make a branding or increasing the value of our society. This will attract volunteers to the society. And this is what we worked carefully about that, starting with collaboration with the International Association in the field of urology, having the eminent key speakers be actively or affiliated to our society. So when you represent the Arab Association or the local society to volunteering action, they will feel that they will belong to something of a value. So I believe that branding or raising the value of your organization or your society, it's very important to attract volunteers to the society.
Yeah, and I want to build on a point also that we were discussing earlier, particularly in the healthcare field. So I was saying to you that in all of the industries and professions that I work with, healthcare is where we probably have the most proactive volunteers. Medical doctors, come with a mission. You're there to save lives. You've known since you ever went into your profession that there is a lot at stake. So in building your associations around urology, what do you think the difference is? Where does the sort of starting point come from that desire to volunteer and to lead? Is it also based around, how you need to advance your career as a medical professional? Everybody needs to be published. How does that influence the way associations are gathered around healthcare and have more proactive volunteerism?
Okay. So in medical fields, all of us believe that there is a spirit and there is the motivation of helping people, doing something for helping others. But I believe that nowadays business comes into medical or healthcare section. So I think each one coming to work in a private section, especially, it has been directed to a profit or a target or whatever to improve his income or his career. Right. So this little bit, the business comes partially into the healthcare. We have to admit that. Yep. Business now, we cannot separate both of them from each other. So this making a more challenging that we have people to have more time to be volunteered in associations. But as you mentioned, yes, many of them, they looking to improving their careers. They have to be well recognized in their subspecialty. So this will be an attractive point to encourage members to be volunteered in the society if they will feel that they will achieve a certain level or a certain value of their career through the organization.
Yeah, so Mark, let's go back to your different experiences. So now very much, in the construction, you're in industry, but you were before with skiing instructors and leisure sports. Right. So building on this, how you motivate and people's either personal or, business objectives or the agenda, how have you seen the difference between working in a leisure industry, in a sports industry versus construction industry, and why people volunteer? What are their motivations? Are they coming for career? Are they coming for advancing science and specifications? You also had a story earlier on about their career needs when an industry was shrinking and the association, so that more people volunteered. So give me a little bit of what is happening in the US today with this move for volunteerism.
So at our table earlier today, we were talking about where one volunteers has everything to do, at least where you are in your life stage. Right. So if I'm new to a career or new to an environment, I probably don't even know. I might be motivated to volunteer, but my experience might be with a community food bank. That looks really different than volunteering in a professional association. My first volunteer experience, I was voluntold by my employer. Congratulations, you're going to join this association. Then, because he had a very strong background from Switzerland, where if you're a ski instructor, that's a 4-year degreed profession. And so it really was a matter of the professional approach that you take. And whether part-time or full-time, those instructors took their job very seriously. I mean, only 20% were full-time in the profession, the rest were part-time, but you mattered to somebody in that moment. If you were a ski patroller, if you made a mistake, that has consequences, very dire consequences. So over time, after being exposed to what we do, we found out that there were these opportunities to teach and to give back, and that not only did that feel really good, but you got a chance to pass on your knowledge. Those folks who were motivated to do that, that's really similar in my construction group as well as the ski instructors group. The thing that's been a little bit different is that you have to make a stronger case sometimes to the employer about why that's a good use of time. So in construction, it can be, or architecture, where you have billable hours, for example, the business pressure on you to bill hours and how much time you take places more pressure on you to be intrinsically motivated. It's myself that I'm trying to improve, and I want to give back, but I have to take my time to do it. Are you at a place and time in your life that you can do it? I think that's the challenge. Right. And that gives rise to the micro-volunteering. You provide opportunities for people to learn and give back in smaller chunks instead of saying, you're going to have to devote a year of your life. Like friends of mine who have been volunteered for the Bar Association. They were a practicing attorney. They took a year off to be the president of their state or national association. And I know people who have lost their jobs because they signed up for a volunteer opportunity. That's not what I'd like the experience. That's not what we're looking for. You want them to come back and say, I had such a great volunteer opportunity that, Nikki, thank you. You're going to want to do this. I had the time of my life, and I'm going to move on to do the next volunteer thing, whatever that is. And you have a reputation for volunteerism as an association. Never forget that. Marketing can't overcome that. If you have a bad reputation, you burn through volunteers. That doesn't bode well for you in the long run. If you have a great reputation, people will want to join in.
Absolutely. And one of your earlier comments, you talked about the career of a volunteer leader, and how in a voluntary position you can learn skills that you'll never perhaps learn in your own job. So for example, if you become the chair of a committee, you learn skills on how to manage people, drive consensus, work together. You might never get that opportunity in your day-to-day life. If you become the chair or the president of a large association, you know, you become the spokesperson. You might not learn that in your professional
Great training for
career.
being a CEO, by the way.
Great training for the CEO. So many of the US associations, and I'd like to ask the audience this question, many of the US associations are absolutely brilliant at having sort of leadership career training, you know, how to use your volunteer life in an association to advance your leadership skills. There's always Leadership Institute training programs and things that many US associations organize. Are there any here in the room that would like to speak to that, that can explain to others a little bit how your associations are helping, you know, your volunteer leaders to build their skill set as leaders? Because leadership is a very important element of volunteering. Do I have, oh, lots of hands. Please, thank you, there's a microphone coming.
So this is not from my current association, but from my previous life, where we actually became members of associations and try to get on boards of association for money purpose. And I think something here is missing in the conversation since yesterday, that nobody talked about money, but we made employees become on boards of association because that puts them closer to the decision makers. So it was almost mandatory, just like your boss volunteered you to be, but also starting with membership, then also with leadership. So I think what ended up happening is that those who took their leadership roles became better salespeople, became better operation managers, and it did make their career. Even when they left our company and went on to another company, what really stayed with them is their association with associations. And so it becomes their second career or second track, and it's totally voluntary.
Excellent. So that's building a little bit on the earlier session of people's career development. Here we have an example of how a company has seen that, you know, putting employees into active volunteer work in associations is helping them build their communication skills, their leadership skills, becoming better salespeople. So really also encouraging people to use the association as a skills training, development, and confidence gaining environment. That's a lovely story. And John, I think I saw that you wanted to share something.
Thank you, Nikki, and thank you, panelists, for an interesting discussion. I think that boards need to have the boring, basic training of the legislation under which they work and the role of the board as opposed to the role of the Marks of the world, who are the chief executives. That is the fundamental. It's all good giving them public speaking skills and leadership skills, but they do need to know that their role is governance, and they also need to be reminded that the association is going to be better if you have a Mark Dorsey on the team who spends the time running it. Because Dr. Yasser, very interested indeed in your comments, but I think the greatest reward for volunteers is for the volunteering not to take over their life. And the only way it cannot take over their life is if you have qualified professionals who do the vast majority of the work.
Can I comment on that?
I think Dr. Yasser is going to comment first.
I just want to share with you and all of you one of the challenges which we are facing to having the talented volunteers to be included in the organization. In the region, we have the concept that the seniority is belonging to the age. So I have an example for that, a young fellow which is very active, very talented, and he traveled abroad for several countries. He has very well training in robotic surgery, and he is really talented, and he has been very skilled guy, but he has to be a part in the committee of training in this field, but the objection which I'm facing is still young.
Yeah.
So I believe that to put a standard for the job or the criteria for the job description to who will fulfill these criteria, he should get it, whatever his age, whatever his any differences. This is a real problem. I don't know if any other society is facing these things or not, but I believe that we have to stop age limitation for the leadership or a position in organization. Do you agree?
That's a fascinating point. Can I put that on hold for a second and come back to it? Because I think it's an absolutely brilliant point, and I'd also like to hear what some of the room has to say. But Mark, I think you also wanted to just comment on John's comments about governance.
Well, I wanted to build on that too, because the part of it isn't so much we get into the process of who does what, and I certainly have to credit a lot of my success to having been with the Association of Associations and ASAE that exposed me to a lot of this opportunity. But the key is what work is delegated, and if the volunteer is focused on subject matter expertise and contributing, that's why they join. Nobody joins to write bylaws. Nobody joins to figure, I cannot wait to get up and write policy unless it happens to be, feeding into government policy. And yeah, whether I happen to be a paid professional or not, I appreciate my career very much, but I've also served as a chapter volunteer, and the best experiences have been when we're very clear about who's going to go off and do things and who's really going to govern the organization. And I think sometimes those barriers get thrown in the way to the youngsters because they go, well, you don't have that experience. Well, where else are you going to get that experience? You have to have that permission to fail, like we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. So we'll come back to the role of younger leaders and also the engagement of younger volunteers. I think there was also a comment. If we could have the microphone over there, please.
Hello, my name is Munish. I'm the founder of Emerging Young Insurance Professionals here in Dubai.
Perfect.
What I'm about to share is going to answer a lot of questions and a lot of comments that have been made. What we felt was by creating the platform for emerging young insurance professionals, there was a disconnect among the current groups that are in existence in the insurance industry in UAE, in the Middle East. Therefore, this platform was a stepping stone for, be it leadership roles into C-level executive positions and or just to get some exposure out there. But what we found was there wasn't much support, again, from the senior community. So therefore, then, we came up with an idea of doing a leadership event. So since our inception from March, we've had around 3 leadership events. So what we did was we reached out to the C-level executives within the insurance industry to come out and talk about their personal leadership traits and experiences. More of a casual conversation, not an award sort of formal black and white event. It was just a casual, high bar, open forum and so on. So that opened up a lot of eyes for C-level executives, because what was happening was they didn't really get to know or hear what was happening on the ground level. And then for the audience, they were having an avenue to reach out to them to say, why should I join the insurance industry when my friend as a blogger is earning so much, and so on. So, these questions, and what happened was with that event, it trickled down to, could we do more and more? So I think it's just trying to find that connection among the leaders and the senior community, tapping into the younger ones.
Brilliant. That's fantastic to hear that. I'll come back to the comment in just a second. So here we have, young professionals who are actually forming an association because they're not necessarily finding the outlet in the mature associations. And your engagement and then proactively reaching out to those who are in leadership positions, again, to help with some of the comments we were talking about in the earlier discussion around career development. So before I come back to the audience, let's go back and address so Mark, maybe you can speak to this first. How are you bringing in young professionals into voluntary positions and helping them to work up into leadership? And do you have a specific, policy around young professionals on the board, for example?
Not so much on the board. I think this is an area for a bit of hand-wringing. This is a great comment, because if you don't find a way to welcome anybody that's interested, your own association members may create a competitor to you right off the bat. So you have to be mindful of that. One thing certainly I think about the States is if you have something to offer that's of value, you generally will be welcomed in. And you have to be welcoming. And you have to give that space so that people can make mistakes and have those opportunities. So do we actively recruit? I think actively recruiting necessarily on the board for a young professional, I think it's more being included in the conversation. We were talking about the table the other day where a group of us in our 50s were talking about how to design a volunteer experience for somebody in their 20s. Well, you have the people in their 20s design the volunteer experience and support that when and where you can, and then you have decisions to make about whether or not you can sustain it. But at least creating an incubator and having that opportunity for folks to try new ideas and experiment, that's really the key. And so we look at trying to engage in task forces or whether it's a virtual volunteering, even if it's a teleconference opportunity, creating many more smaller opportunities that are bite-sized are one way that we're starting to see more engagement. And then the other is that paying attention to where you are from a career standpoint. When we talk to young professionals, they're wanting to know how to navigate the world of work, much more so in many cases than just simply volunteering for the association. So we have to keep our expectations in check about what realistically can be accomplished as somebody is starting out career-wise.
So you've talked about micro possibilities also to engage the younger member. And I just want to share, I've worked with a couple of healthcare associations over the years where we have created very specifically through the bylaws a position for a young professional on the board for the very reason that you said, because sort of hierarchically and traditionally in the medical career, you're still a young professional when you're 37. I remember being stunned when I was 40 and hearing that, I was a young professional by medical standards. So it's different from profession to profession and industry to industry. So some of these associations made it mandatory to have the voice of a young professional on the board, exactly to sort of counter what you were saying, that the voice of the board is very much those who are in their 50s and 60s, and how can you design engagement for the younger professionals if you're at the top of your career. Have you come across that in this region at all?
Actually, what we learned from other societies that they have a seat in the board for the young members. So it's officially that they have to represent and they have to be a part of the decision taking in the organization. But in our association, till the moment, we don't have this position activated, but we are working on that. And what we are trying to make it more clear, the diversity of opportunity, which we are offering to all members, to trying to discover more talented young urologists, and making each opportunity is well-defined, standard, with a clear task, and then criteria of who achieving, so it can be well recognized.
So do we have any other comments from the room on engagement of young professionals? Yes, the microphone over there, thank you.
Thank you. Iman Hekel, Chairman of Peace and Development Council from Egypt. Once I have graduated, I was member in trustees board in NGO. And after 5 years, I have established my own NGO, it's Peace and Development Council. This is actually a great experience for learning. So being a volunteer is not a challenge, because you learn so much, and now I'm making the same with the students. I give them the opportunity to share with organizing events, and they very proud to write it in their resume, and they take certificates from us. I think this is a good chance for students to be a volunteer. It's not a challenge. This is my own idea.
Excellent. So again, another proactive example. You both happen to be sitting at the same table. There must be some commonality there. A proactive example of how you've taken, the leadership position and you've created something to allow an outlet for younger professionals. Fantastic. And there was a comment here, I believe. Start. Thank you. Susan, I'll come to you next. Yeah.
I'm Carrie Karowski with the Sulfur Institute. I think it's also very important that the volunteer experience needs to be more friendly for women, because women who are starting out early in their career or perhaps even mid-career, women are still doing most of the child care within their homes. And if given a choice between volunteering for an organization and whether you can stay at home with your children for a weekend, that's a difficult decision. There needs to be child care available, or incentives where perhaps they can bring their children with them, or any other sort of life events that get involved, because women are struggling, at least in the United States, at getting those extra resume points and that extra experience, and they are constantly lagging behind by about 7 or 8 years, and we still have, you know, we're unable with this culture to maintain a balance and have equal representation for men and women.
Oh, excellent comment. And I think many associations, again, one of our clients has a young professionals group, you know, special interest group. We were talking on our table this morning about special interest groups, so young professionals and also a women's professionals. This is an engineering association, so it's particularly tough for women, so appreciate your comment. And Susan, I think you wanted to add something?
This is kind of a bold example, and it's not from ASAE. Susan Robertson with ASAE. I was serving on a board of an organization called Youth Service America, and for some time they had been struggling to engage young people, and the goal of the organization was to have a service opportunity for every young person, not K through 12 and into college, but more in the high school and college area in every zip code in the United States. And so what they did is to hire a very well-qualified consultant from a big firm and ask the young people that they were trying to engage to write the strategic plan for the organization. Yeah. No adults were involved whatsoever. And it was probably the best, most thoughtful strategic plan I have ever seen. And the point of that is to give it over to the people who you're trying to influence, and it becomes their own. Yeah. And from that point forward, it was just like jet fuel, it took off. So it was a really good example of not only engaging young people, but empowering them.
Excellent, thank you. So what we're going to do now is just for 4 minutes on your tables, I'd like you to try and reach a discussion around what is the #1 challenge and what is the #1 amongst the table commonality, because there's lots of different industries here, there's lots of different nationalities sitting around the table. So what is the one common feature at your table regarding volunteerism, and what is the one challenge? And I'll give you 4 minutes to discuss that, and I'm going to ask Dr. Yasser and Mark also to comment on that when we get back. So 4 minutes, and then we'll do a quick round the table to get some feedback. #1 common thing, #1 challenge. Okay, I'm going to be very rude and interrupt your discussions. It's wonderful to hear everybody talking, and you probably haven't reached consensus.
Well, we found something right away about the commonality of things, and actually it was Connie here who had suggested it, so she should actually have the microphone. But there's 2 things. One is getting people to, when they do volunteer, to actually follow through on what they say they're going to do. And the main challenge, what was the main challenge that we talked about?
Never mind. I'll go to someone else.
Good, please.
Okay, we've had a commonality. Anyone volunteer for a challenge, please? Yes? No? Yes? Okay, thank you.
So, Matthew Duva with the International Association for the Study of Pain. We talked a lot at our table about one of our challenges is vetting qualified volunteers, so we get a lot of people, some of us have people that want to participate, but knowing that they're going to follow through and they're going to do the work. But also we talked a lot about in organizations where there aren't a lot of qualified people, or seemingly they're not people volunteering, how can we be better about articulating what the exact jobs are that we want them to do, so that they might be more willing to raise their hand and engage. So
Yeah.
we sort of had both at the same time.
Brilliant. I know that the panel will agree with that, the mandate and the clarity around roles. Okay, thank you. We'll take one last comment. Sorry, I know we could all discuss this forever, but I'm getting told that I need to wrap this up. So.
Hi, my name is Naina. I'm representing two associations. One is Dubai Shipping Association, and the other one is Women in Logistics at the Middle East branch. The Dubai Shipping Association, we have a challenge. We employ the volunteers from the universities. We reward them for their hard work. Apart from that, we see these volunteers, whoever have any financial difficulties, to continue their studies. We ask our board as well as our general members to contribute and help them to develop their career. For example, recently one 16-year-old boy wanted to become a pilot. That's what he said about his dream. But he said he doesn't have funds. So we have decided to help him for that.
Wow.
Women in logistics, we have a very big challenge. We are having 50 ladies. Again, it's a non-profit organization. We don't charge any membership fees. But we ourselves fund these activities. And the Emirati lady from one of the universities who was excellent in the logistics, we have helped her to get a job in one of the logistics firms.
Excellent.
So that's
excellent.
it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Yes, definitely. So, Mark, let's come back to you for a closing comment about sort of summing up what you thought was an overarching commonality.
So the commonality I heard were struggles and questions around what I would frame as diversity and inclusion, whether it's getting young professionals, gender equity, different cultures engaged in the volunteer workforce, if you will. That's really critical because it's well documented that more diverse and inclusive businesses enjoy higher productivity, profitability, and satisfaction. So I would suggest that, to me, it's how do we address that issue? How do we define, onboard, recruit, and perform and reward in the volunteer workplace so that our associations and organizations are relevant and vibrant going forward? So it all ties into this question of which folks have a seat of their voice and their vote at the table.
Excellent, great, thank you. And Dr. Yasser, what do you think is the sort of overarching common challenge that you hear from all of the comments today?
Yeah, actually, I believe that nowadays with the technology, internet, communication, a lot of ways to have volunteers is too much easy than last few years. But the real challenge is the volunteer retention. How to keep the volunteer working in your organization for a long term. This is the real challenge, and which we as organization or societies, we have to work hardly to find the way to keep the successful volunteers in a small task, how to be continued and retained, engaged with the society for long term.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you all for your participation. I think there were some really interesting discussions. You can carry them on over lunch. And please join me in thanking Dr. Yasser and Mark for their comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. That's great.